If you spend any length of time studying old maps or historical documents, you will occasionally find references to places that just don't exist anymore, or accounts of vast, bustling conurbations and thriving commercial centres, but the place names given to them is nothing more than a row of isolated cottages today. In this series of videos, we'll be taking you back to these places, looking at what they were like in their heyday, explaining what brought about their dramatic demises, and showing you what clues we still have left to what used to be. Hello and welcome to another one of my videos. This one of three that retraces the remains of lost settlements. We start by popular demand with what, according to legend at the very least, is the lost city of Kenfig. Now no more than a couple of houses and a pub. In its heyday, supposedly the capital of the Kingdom of Morgannog, certainly the commercial hub of the old medieval kingdom. But when you come here today, there is not very much evidence of a thriving commercial hub. There is not much evidence of anything at all, really. So what happened here? How did this place fall spectacularly from grace and disappear pretty much without a trace? We investigate further. The part of the country we're looking at here is on the South Wales coast between Porthcawl and Port Talbot. It lies on the banks of a river, also called the Kenfig, and it's an area largely covered today with sand dunes and lakes. The only buildings here are a small handful of cottages and farms, and a pub. We also have the ruined remains of a castle to the north. So how do we know there was ever anything more to it than this? There is plenty of archaeological evidence that there's been a settlement here since the Neolithic period. We also have the milestones and the Via Julia Maritima and the tomb of Bodvok, the Silurian chieftain, close by to demonstrate that people were living here during the Roman era as well. But the earliest historical reference we have to the existence of a town here is the Gwentian Chronicle of Caradog of Llancarvan, dated 893 AD. He refers to Kenfig by name in an account of a Viking raid. So that tells us two things. One, that there was a place called Kenfig in the 9th century, and two, that there was something sufficiently valuable there to be worth raiding. Interestingly, there is a theory that the name Kenfig is a hangover from the Vikings, as it's phonetically close to the Danish for bend in the River Ken. It's possible. Nearby Sker is definitely Norse, and of course Swansea just across the bay was a Viking stronghold. But there are plenty of other options for the origins of the name. Ken a Fig is Welsh for head of the swamp, and in the 12th century there was a Norman lord in the area whose name is recorded as Sinfig. But as it was already being called Kenfig 400 years earlier, that is probably the least likely source. But who knows? One thing we do know, though, is that by the 11th century this was a sufficiently important place to require a castle to defend it. In the period of history we're talking about here, South Wales was made up of three small kingdoms: Deheubarth in the west, Glywysing in the middle, and Gwent in the east. By 1066, the Monmouthshire part of Gwent had fallen to Harold the Saxon King of England, but the remainder of the kingdom had merged with Glywysing and was known as Morgannog, the name which Glamorgan came from. Now this place is listed on Google Maps as being a Norman castle, which ultimately is true in terms of the stone remains that we've got here now, but there was a castle on this site way before, and we've got some fairly reliable historical evidence that what had been on this site was in fact one of the royal households of Iestyn ap Cwrgant, the king of Glywysing and Morgannog. Once the Normans had subdued Morgannog, establishing an enclave in Kenfig served two purposes. Politically, having a Norman lord occupying the formal royal court sent out a clear message that they were now very much in charge. But also economically,
This port and trading town was the commercial heart of the region. If that could be harnessed, it could provide a massive new income stream for the invaders, so Kenfig became a town in Wales, where the Welsh themselves were not allowed to own property, so the new rulers could maintain absolute control. Funnily enough, the locals got a bit cross about that. So in 1147, a timber Motte and Bailey castle needed to be built here. This got raided and burned to the ground so frequently that by 1185 it had to be replaced by a stone one. There's not much to give it away now, but when built, it had a moat which enclosed an 11-acre bailey, which is huge, way bigger than the structure that would have stood in Cardiff at that time, which again gives an indication of how important this place was. It also gives an idea of how frequent and violent the attacks on the town and the castle were. We have records of sieges and raids led by the likes of Morgan Gam, Welsh Lord of Avan in 1232, Howell ap Meredydd in 1295 and Owain Glyndŵr in 1405. There's even a record of the wooden stockade which surrounded the town being struck by lightning and burned to the ground, so it must have seemed to the English settlers in Kenfig that even God didn't want them there. But when it wasn't being attacked, what was life like in this town? Busy. Thanks to a series of town charters dating back to 14th of May 1360, numerous deed of land transfers and the 51 town ordinances, we have a clear picture of the town's layout and economic activities. First and foremost, it was a port. Alongside Neath and Aberthaw, Kenfig was one of the principal trading hubs on the Bristol Channel, or the Severn Sea as the channel was known in medieval times. It was also a bustling market town, where goods once unloaded could be traded with local merchants. We know from a collection of 14th century land deeds that within the town there were bakers, blacksmiths, brewers, butchers, chandlers, cordwainers, millers, pelters, tailors, tanners, and wheelwrights. We even know that the rent charged to the blacksmiths was a penny a year. But what about the layout of the town itself? Activity in the town centred around a broad high street. It had a guild hall at one end and a town cross at the other. The town ordinances make it clear that the inhabitants of Kenfig were obsessed with keeping the high street immaculately clean. Butchers were prohibited from throwing bones and offcuts into the street, which was common practice in other towns at the time, and the town's burgesses were responsible for the upkeep of the walkways in front of their shops. There was also legislation to keep the high street free of drunks and beggars and the playing of ball games. Other streets in the town that get a mention include the Shambles, which is where the town's abattoirs were located, East Street and West Street, which transversed the high street down the middle, and Monk Street, where there was an almshouse to provide some comfort for the poor, which was run by the monks of Margam Abbey. At its height, the population of Kenfig would have been over 1,000 inhabitants, with 150 burgage plots. Now I realise that by modern standards that sounds like a small village, but that would have made it a sizable town by medieval standards, bigger than nearby Neath and about half the size of Cardiff. So what went wrong? How could such a major settlement and commercial centre just vanish to nothing? We have a rather spectacular legend about how the town came to such an abrupt end.
The story goes that back in the medieval period, when the De Clare family were the Earls of Glamorgan, De Clare had a very beautiful daughter, and she came to visit Kenfig one day, where she was seen by a local peasant boy who fell madly in love with her. However, due to the differences in their station, they both knew that their love was impossible. But just to give him some hope, she gave him a favour, a lace glove, just to let him know that her love was reciprocated. Day and night he wrestled with how to make their love a reality, but came up with nothing, and then he hatched a cunning plan. He went to visit a noble lord who had fought in holy wars and ever since dedicated his life to God, who lived a lonely life far away from all the crowds. he made his way up to his castle and sat down and explained his plight to the old gentleman, asking that perhaps the old gentleman would be prepared to pass the young man off as a long-lost heir, so that he might be able to win his love's hand. Well, the old man, being a man of God, was outraged at the idea of the deception and said that love won by deception would inevitably be discovered and cause pain. The young man, young, impetuous, eyes passionately burning with lust, could control himself no longer, and he reached out and grabbed the first thing that came to hand. It happened to be the old gentleman's trusty sword, which he wheeled through the air and in one blow cut his head clean off. Overcome with remorse and with terror of what the consequences might be if discovered, he carried the old man's remains to a nearby lake and hid them away in the murky waters. And then his plan became even darker. He decided to assume the identity of the old gentleman's long-lost son. He presented himself as such, and eventually time came round when he could once again meet the woman of his dreams, the daughter of the de Clare family. Now presenting himself as a man of means and a man of lineage, he was of course accepted, and soon the wedding was held here in Kenfig, and in the Guild Hall a fine banquet was set for all the local dignitaries. But during the celebrations, the atmosphere was cut by the resounding ghostly voice calling out, "Vengeance will be mine." The guests were terrified. They hid wherever they could. But the young man, knowing that he was perhaps the cause of this, inquired further. "What do you mean, vengeance will be mine? What will be the vengeance?" And the voice responded, 9 generations shall pass, and then this town shall be engulfed. Well, he told the guests what the ghostly voice had said, and they immediately dismissed that. 9 generations, we'll all be long gone, forget about that. But within a couple of weeks, what people were unaware of was the 9th generation to be born into the town was born. And so, with a tremendous clap of thunder, a storm gathered over the town of Kenfig.
The voice echoed once more, threatening, "Vengeance will be mine." Terrified, all the people of the town ran to their homes and bolted all their windows and doors, but to no avail. For suddenly a huge tidal wave rushed in from the sea, up the River Kenfig, and completely engulfed the town, obliterating all its fine buildings and depositing a wall of sand to keep the lake from ever draining. All the inhabitants were drowned, and the only sign that the town had ever been there were the chimneys of the houses, still smoking above the waterline. On the shore they found the gloves of the old knight, which washed up by the feet of a young descendant. As they were discovered, the voice of the old knight was heard from the sky praising God. The legend has it that on a clear day, when the water of the lake is still, you can still see the houses at the bottom of it, and if you listen carefully, you can occasionally hear the bells of the old church still ringing, warning of an approaching storm. So is this legend true? It is a brilliant story, but rather disappointingly, it was not ghostly vengeance that brought about the demise of Kenfig. It was Mother Nature. A series of terrible storms in the 14th century regularly caused the marshlands surrounding the town to flood, and eventually this led to the beginning of the now 70-acre lake that we see there today, known as Kenfig Pool. So, was it this that caused the flooding of Kenfig? Well, alas, stories of the town being at the bottom of the lake are a romantic invention. It makes for a cracking legend, but in reality the old town was located quite a bit to the north of the lake, pretty much alongside where the M4 crosses the London to Swansea railway line today. So if it's not under the lake, why did the town disappear? Well, these storms brought in a lot more than just torrential rain. They also blew in a lot of sand. which soon started to form dunes.
So the problem with sand, once it starts to be swirled up by the wind, is that it gets into absolutely everything. And back in medieval Wales, of course, unlike the Middle East and North Africa, they weren't used to dealing with sand. So the problem was, every day more sand would be brought in, and every day another couple of yards of the village would disappear. Soon roads became choked up, gardens were incapable of supporting crops, and there was nothing else for it but to start abandoning those parts of the village that had been lost to the sands. That eventually, of course, took over virtually all of the settlement, bar just a small handful of houses that were on the higher ground, which still remain there to this day.
By the time the 16th century chronicler Leland visited the place, he described it as a little village on the east side of Kenfig, and a castle both in ruin, and almost choked and devoured with the sands that the Severn Sea there casteth up. Still, even though most of the town is now gone, there are still a couple of mementos left if you want to seek them out. The remains of the Norman castle, for example. Even if they are a little overgrown, there's still plenty to see. There's also the church at Magdalen, but best of all, what remains of the old Guildhall building, the place where the ghostly voice called out during the wedding celebrations, is now the Prince of Wales pub, a place synonymous with ghostly voices even today, and also a great place to stop for a pint and admire the sun setting on the lake at the end of a day exploring the area. If you want to read more about the history of Kenfig, then I would recommend this book. It's called A History of Kenfig by Mansell Jones, published by Goylake Publishing in 2011. And if you enjoyed the legend about the Lost City, you can read that and other similar legends from the Glamorgan area in my own humble effort, entitled Legends and Folklore of Bridgend and the Vale, available in all good bookshops, on Amazon, or direct from the author at grahamlovelickedwards.com. There's a link in my bio. How thoroughly modern.
I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and we're making 3 others. We're making one about the lost village of Candleston, one about the lost city of Trelech, and another of the lost Roman town of Bovium. So subscribe to this channel so you get access to all of the videos we make about our disappearing settlements. And until the next time we meet, please enjoy your history.